Trade wars are good and easy to win, President Trump tweeting early Friday morning.
China
is warning a trade war would be, quote, a disaster.
I love them. China.
Do you still believe China is raping the United States, Mr. President?
Welcome to Voxiversity. I'm Vox Day. Now, the other day, I was invited to appear on Chinese state television.
Hello.
Hello. And it was interesting because they had some real experts there, people who really knew what they were talking about. And one of the things that they were all convinced was that trade war was necessarily bad for everyone. What they'll usually tell you is that free trade is good for everyone. And if you ask them why, they'll say, well, David Ricardo. Pin them down a little bit more, they'll say David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage proves that free trade is always good for everyone. But the thing is, that's not true, and it hasn't been true for over 200 years. There's actually 7 major flaws in Ricardo's argument. Number 1, the idea that the competitive advantage is sustainable. Number 2, that there are no externalities. Number 3, that production factors can move between industries without cost. Number 4, that there's no change in the ratio of income inequality. Number 5, the idea that international capital is not mobile. Number 6, short-term efficiency causes long-term growth. And number 7, it's dependent upon the idea that the foreign productivity does not improve. You probably know that GDP is how we measure a national economy. GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it's made up of 4 parts. The formula that the economists use to calculate GDP, and therefore measure the size of the national economy, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And what those stand for is consumer spending, investment, government spending, and the trade sector, exports minus imports. And let's just plug in some imaginary numbers. Let's say that each of these 4 aspects of the economy are each worth $5. So the consumer spending is $5, the investment is $5, the government spending is $5, and the net exports minus imports is $5. They have a GDP of 20. That is what we would call an economy with a trade surplus. And examples of that would be Germany. Another example is Mexico.
We're not paying for that fucking wall.
And the wall just got 10 feet taller, believe me.
Now let's say they get into a trade war and they lose all their exports and all their imports. That means that the economy has gone from the size of 20 down to 15. The trade war has been bad for them. Their economy has shrunk, people lose their jobs, and so forth. But now let's look at a different scenario. Let's look at a scenario where the economy is bringing in more imports than it sells in exports. And obviously, the biggest example of that is the US economy. The US economy currently runs a $600 billion annual trade deficit. But let's stick with the imaginary numbers. Consumer spending is 5, investment is 5, government spending is 5, but exports minus imports is negative 5. So your economy is 10. But now let's imagine what happens if you get into a trade war and suddenly X minus M becomes 0 instead of negative 5. Then your economy grows from 10 up to 15 because the trade sector is no longer a negative. And that's why it is simply false to say that a trade war is necessarily bad for the United States. In fact, if we were to take the situation to the absolute extreme, if we stopped allowing foreign nations to sell their goods into the United States, and we stopped selling US goods outside the country, that would be an immediate $600 billion boost to the US economy, which, because the US economy is $19.7 trillion, would immediately increase the size of the US economy to $20.3 trillion, which is the equivalent of 3% annual GDP growth. So that doesn't mean that a trade war is necessarily going to be good for the US. There are other factors involved. But what you can say for certain is that it is absolutely wrong, and it is absolutely false to say that a trade war and tariffs are necessarily bad for the US economy. This is Voxiversity. I'm Vox Day.